Raid on the underground nightclub. 300 federal agents arrest 100 undocumented immigrants. In the early hours of Sunday morning, more than 300 federal agents stormed a hidden underground nightclub in Colorado Springs, launching a raid that would make headlines across the nation. It was an operation that involved various federal agencies, including the FBI, Immigration and Customs Enforcement, ICE, the Bureau of Alcohol, Tobacco, Firearms and Explosives, ATF, the IRS, and even the U.S. Army Criminal Investigation Division. Local law enforcement also joined in the raid. Their mission: to dismantle a criminal enterprise operating under the guise of a nightclub, which had become a haven for dangerous gangs and illegal activities. The raid, which occurred at approximately 3:45 a.m., targeted an underground venue that had been operating secretly in the city, seemingly unnoticed by the public. At the heart of the raid was a startling discovery. 114 individuals were arrested that night. Many of them were undocumented immigrants, and some had ties to notorious criminal gangs. Among the illegal substances found were drugs, including meth cocaine, and even a dangerous new drug known as pink cocaine. Firearms were also seized during the operation. The event wasn't just another bust. It was part of a larger, more coordinated effort to target criminal activity linked to gangs operating in the U.S. One such gang, the Venezuelan group Tren de Aragua, had been connected to the underground nightclub, and it wasn't alone. The infamous MS-13 gang was also reportedly involved, with members of both organizations regularly frequenting the venue. These gangs had established a significant presence, spreading fear and violence across various regions. As federal agents made their way through the club, footage captured the intense moments that followed. Some patrons attempted to flee the scene as agents moved in, while others were apprehended without resistance. The arrest process was swift. Agents were seen escorting the individuals out of the building and onto buses, where they would be taken for processing and likely eventual deportation. This operation was not just a simple drug bust. It was part of a much larger initiative designed to target not only criminals, but also undocumented immigrants involved in illegal activities. The DEA statement confirmed that the nightclub had been a hotbed of criminal activity, but the agents were also focusing on the dangerous and growing network of gangs that operated within its walls. The scale and scope of the operation prompted praise from President Donald Trump, who took to Truth Social to publicly support the raid. He hailed the operation as a victory for law enforcement, emphasizing that it had been carried out against some of the worst criminals in the country: drug dealers, murderers, and violent offenders. Trump's rhetoric continued to stress the need for stronger immigration enforcement, calling for harsher measures to rid the country of those who were living in the U.S. illegally. He went as far as to criticize the judicial system, particularly those judges who were seen as hindering deportation efforts. Trump's strong stance on immigration had been a defining feature of his presidency, and this raid was seen as part of his broader agenda to speed up removals and crack down on illegal immigration. At the same time, the raid raised significant concerns among law enforcement officials. One of the most troubling revelations was the involvement of active-duty U.S. military personnel in the nightclub's activities. Some of the military personnel had been working as private security for the club, while others had attended as patrons. This was deeply concerning for federal investigators, especially since the area surrounding Colorado Springs is home to numerous military bases. The involvement of military members in illegal activities within the civilian sector was a breach of protocol that needed to be taken seriously. Federal authorities pledged to investigate the matter further, as such incidents could undermine the integrity of military operations and security. This raid in Colorado Springs was part of a much larger pattern of coordinated enforcement operations across the country. In Florida, nearly 800 arrests were made during a week-long operation called Operation Tidal Wave, which targeted undocumented immigrants and criminals linked to gangs. The operation was conducted in partnership with local law enforcement and ICE, highlighting the ongoing push to tighten immigration enforcement across the U.S. The federal government under Trump's leadership had taken a hard-line stance on immigration, calling for mass deportations and faster processing for individuals arrested during such raids. Local agencies were expected to work alongside ICE under the 287G program, a controversial agreement that allows local law enforcement to assist in federal immigration enforcement. As the story continued to unfold, Law enforcement officials praised the raid as a success, but the rhetoric surrounding it raised more questions than answers. Was the crackdown on undocumented immigrants the right approach? Was it worth the potential social costs of separating families and deporting people who have been living in the U.S. for years, perhaps even decades? Critics of the administration's policies argued that the approach was too harsh and unfairly targeted vulnerable individuals. They pointed to the fact that many of those arrested had no history of violent crime or serious offenses. But for Trump and his supporters, the operation was part of a broader vision for a safer and more secure America, one where illegal immigration and criminal activity would no longer be tolerated. Meanwhile, the legal battle over deportations continued to intensify. In particular, Trump had been vocal about his desire to challenge legal rulings that hindered his ability to deport alleged gang members, especially those from groups like Tren de Aragua. On Truth Social, he declared that if he didn't win his legal battles in the Supreme Court, the future of the country was at risk. For Trump, this raid was just one part of a larger war on illegal immigration, and the battle was far from over. The courts, however, had different views, with some judges pushing back against the president's hardline stance, claiming that due process and legal rights must be respected. As the week went on, the raids continued. For many, the events in Colorado Springs served as a stark reminder of the lengths the U.S. government was willing to go to in order to enforce its immigration laws. But for others, the situation was far more complex. Could the system be reformed to address the root causes of illegal immigration? Was mass deportation the solution? Or was there a better way forward that involved compassion and a more nuanced approach to immigration policy? The raid in Colorado Springs was just one chapter in an ongoing story that will continue to unfold in the coming months and years. As federal agencies ramped up enforcement efforts across the country, the nation would continue to grapple with the difficult questions surrounding immigration, criminal justice, and the balance between security and human rights. The story was far from over. It was clear that the future of U.S. immigration policy was in the balance. Aftermath of the underground nightclub raid, the fight for immigration reform. The dust had barely settled after the massive raid in Colorado Springs, but the ripples of what happened would soon be felt across the country. Federal agents had arrested 114 people, seized drugs and weapons, and dismantled a major criminal network operating under the cover of an underground nightclub. For many, it was seen as a victory, a triumph of law enforcement, a victory for national security. But for others, it was just the beginning of a much bigger fight. The immediate aftermath of the raid left both the federal agencies and the public grappling with the fallout. While the arrest numbers were high, there were concerns about the collateral damage. Many of those arrested were not violent criminals, but undocumented immigrants who had been living in the U.S. for years. They were now facing the threat of deportation, often to countries they barely remembered or had fled from for safety. Families were torn apart in the name of security, and critics were quick to voice their outrage. Local activists in Colorado Springs organized protests, demanding answers and accountability for what they called a human rights violation. These activists argued that the crackdown disproportionately targeted vulnerable communities. They questioned the wisdom of raiding an underground nightclub and rounding up undocumented immigrants without regard for their individual stories or circumstances. For them, it was not a victory, but a reflection of an immigration system that had failed to distinguish between criminals and law-abiding people. The federal government, on the other hand, doubled down on its stance. President Donald Trump, in particular, had made it clear that these operations were just the beginning. In a speech following the raid, Trump praised the efforts of federal law enforcement and warned that more such raids would follow. He declared that the United States could no longer afford to tolerate illegal immigration, particularly from criminal gangs like Tren de Aragua and MS-13, who had infiltrated the country. Trump's rhetoric painted a picture of a nation under siege, one where dangerous individuals, criminals, had taken advantage of the immigration system to gain a foothold in the U.S. This is about protecting American citizens. Trump said in his address, "We cannot let criminals, drug dealers, and murderers have free rein in our country. We will do whatever it takes to keep our streets safe." This message resonated strongly with Trump supporters, who viewed these raids as necessary for preservation of law and order. They saw the immigrants detained as criminals or potential threats to American society, regardless of their individual circumstances. To them, this was the price of keeping the country safe, and they applauded the president's aggressive approach. But the backlash was just as strong from other quarters. Legal experts, civil rights groups, and advocacy organizations warned that the raids were a dangerous overreach, violating constitutional rights and due process. The American Civil Liberties Union, ACLU, immediately called for an investigation into the tactics used during the raid, arguing that the mass arrests violated fundamental principles of justice. They claimed that the raids were carried out indiscriminately, with little regard for the legal rights of those detained. In the legal community, there were also growing concerns about the implications of the raid and others like it. Lawyers began to prepare for a wave of legal challenges. Could the government legally deport people without giving them a fair trial? Could the raids be justified under the Constitution? The courts would soon become the battleground for these questions, and the future of America's immigration policies would likely hinge on the outcomes. For the people detained during the raid, the immediate future was uncertain. The processing centers were overwhelmed, and many were sent to detention facilities while awaiting deportation proceedings. Those who have been living in the U.S. for years, some even decades, faced the terrifying reality of being torn from their families, their homes, and their communities. Some had children who were U.S. citizens. Others had built lives in the country they now called home. For them, the raid wasn't just an arrest. It was a destruction of everything they had worked for. One woman, Maria, who had been living in the U.S. for over 10 years, spoke out after her release from the processing center. "I'm not a criminal," she said, her voice shaking. "I just wanted a better life for my children. I never hurt anyone. Why am I being treated like a criminal?" Maria's story became emblematic of the millions of people who were caught up in the debate over immigration in America. For her, the raid was not just an operation to capture criminals. It was a personal tragedy, a moment that had ripped apart her family. Her story was one of many, and the public was divided. Some sympathized with the detainees, calling for a more humane approach to immigration reform. Others supported the government's actions, believing that it was necessary to rid the country of illegal immigrants and criminals. The raid in Colorado Springs had sparked a nationwide conversation that would only intensify as more raids took place. Meanwhile, the legal challenges were mounting. Some judges began to issue temporary restraining orders, halting deportations in certain cases. The courts were tasked with balancing the government's interest in national security with the constitutional rights of those being detained. Could the government justify such sweeping actions, or would the courts step in to curb the raids? These were questions that would have far-reaching implications, not just for immigration policy, but for the very fabric of the American justice system. As the days passed, the tension in Colorado Springs and across the country grew. The raids had undoubtedly sent a message, but at what cost? Were they truly making the country safer, or were they creating a divide that could tear apart communities, families, and the legal rights of millions of people? For those who lived in the shadows, the underground nightclub raid was more than just a criminal operation. It was a moment that exposed the cracks in America's immigration system, cracks that could no longer be ignored. And as the legal battles unfolded, one thing was clear. The fight for immigration reform was far from over.